In my review of episode 4 of Loki, I joked that Victor Timely failed because he did not have the power of love, similar to Ant-Man in Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. But in episode 5, Loki learns to travel back in time and fix the TVA using the power of friendship. I also mentioned in that review that the explosion of the temporal loom and Loki's reaction was very similar to Thor in Infinity War. And in a way, this episode is also similar to Infinity War because, like Tony seeing his fellow Avengers being dusted, Loki watches his friends basically turn into time spaghetti. But this episode is also similar to Avengers Endgame, where Loki basically takes the place of Ant-Man, and he's going around trying to gather people to travel through time and fix things to undo the snap, or in this case, undo the explosion of the temporal loom. So first he finds a nerdy guy who can build a time travel device. Then he finds other people, including a reluctant hero who possesses a time travel device, being the He Who Remains Tempad. So there are some interesting parallels there. But as corny as it is, Loki really does save the day using the power of friendship. And at this point, I don't think we're even looking at the character of Loki anymore. Some people think that's a good thing. I'm not so sure about it, but I am sure that this was a great episode. Episode 5, Science Fiction, starts out with Loki in the TVA by himself, right after the explosion. Everyone else is gone. He's walking through the TVA and there's not a single living being there. And that's when he starts time slipping again. And while he's time slipping, he sees a version of himself from just a minute prior. And that's when the TVA starts to break down. Luckily, he manages to time slip at the very last second, and the TVA monitor says failsafe activated. Unlike before, where he was simply time slipping through the TVA, he ends up in San Francisco in 1962 at Alcatraz, where he finds Casey, or rather Frank, before he became Casey at the TVA. He time slips again to 2012 New York, where he meets B-15, who is a doctor. He time slips again to 2022 Cleveland, Ohio, where Mobius, who in this world is known as Dawn, is at his job selling jet skis and ATVs, and he also has 2 sons. Once more, he time slips to Pasadena, 1994, where he meets OB, who in this world is known as AD Doug. Now, if you remember from episode 1, there was a book in the end credits called The Zartan Contingent, which I theorize had something to do with G.I. Joe because of the name. I was completely wrong. Instead, Obi in his original life was A.D. Doug, the author of The Zartan Contingent, which is a science fiction novel. Now, he does have a scientific background. He's a theoretical physicist, but his main passion, his main pursuit, is to be a science fiction author, which is a failing career for him. It's so bad that he lives in an abandoned factory that looks very similar to his workshop at the TVA. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about Obi in a little bit. But when Loki meets him, at first he's dejected because he's just a science fiction author. But when he reveals his scientific background, he asks A.D. Doug, who I'm going to call Obi from now on because saying A.D. Doug over and over again is going to be incredibly annoying. So Obi helps him to figure out that if Loki can time slip on purpose and with direction, he can go and find and gather all the other people that were in the room with him during the explosion of the temporal loom. Because by gathering the collective temporal aura, they may be able to purposely travel back to the explosion and stop it from happening. But before they can figure it out, Loki gives Obi the TVA manual, which Obi will use to create a kind of antiquated tempad. And right afterwards, he ends up time slipping again. So he once again ends up in Cleveland, Ohio with Dawn, and he tries to convince Dawn to leave his life and help him save the multiverse. Of course, Dawn doesn't want to just leave his sons behind, even though Loki assures him that with time travel, he can literally place him back right at the moment where he left, so that his sons would never miss him. But Don would still miss his sons. He doesn't seem convinced until Obi shows up with the tempad, proving time travel is real, and Don decides to join them. He also recruits B-15 and Casey, and so you have those 4 members all together, none of whom know each other or anything about the TVA. But Loki still needs to recruit Sylvie. So he goes to Sylvie's timeline back in Broxton, Oklahoma, and he explains everything to her, but she still rejects him. She tells him that he needs to live his own life, go write his own story, which points to a bigger plot line that I'll talk about in a little bit. But finally, he admits to her that everything he's doing is not really because he wants to save the multiverse, but because he wants his friends back. But she still says no. So he goes back to Pasadena to Obi's factory, and he basically gives up and tells everyone else they should just go back to their time periods, even though he knows that the branches are being broken down. Now, back in Sylvie's timeline, she goes to a music shop and her branch starts to break down. And that's when she decides to join Loki. And I assume she's able to do it because she's using He Who Remains Tempad, so unlike Loki, he doesn't need to time slip. But her character is the most annoying character in the season because every single episode since episode 2, Loki has had to explain to her that if she doesn't help fix the TVA, all the branches are going to be broken down, including the one she wants to live in. He tells her this every single episode, but it isn't until it's actually happening in front of her face that she finally decides to help Loki. So now everyone is brought together and they can fix everything, except that the temp pad that OB built has disappeared. And then one by one, each member of the group starts to disappear until Sylvie goes. And as Loki is trying to grab onto these strands of his friends, it's at that moment that he learns how to time slip. And he time slips back to the moment when Sylvie walked into the room. Realizing he knows how to do it now, he time slips again back to just before the explosion of the temporal loom, but after Victor Timely had died, or at least I think it is. And that's where the episode ends. So, unlike I thought in my theory video, this episode was bigger than just Mobius's origin, which is what I thought it was going to be. In fact, it was actually a pretty great episode, probably better than episodes 2 or 3. But yeah, I don't know if this helps or hinders my theory that Loki is the one who created the TVA originally. On the one hand, obviously he can go back in time, and it seemed like he was going to be the creator of the TVA because he was gathering those characters from their branches before they knew anything about the TVA. But since it ended up with him just traveling back in time to when they were still TVA agents, I'm not sure if that means he's the creator of the TVA or if he's just going to use his time slipping ability to fix things as they were broken when he was there. But if anything, we did learn who Mobius was in his past life. We learned who Obi was in his past life, which was actually pretty surprising. And honestly, the other two characters aren't that important. But like I said, it was really annoying that it took this long for Sylvie to get with the program. I mean, it's not just her selfishness, it's like the writers wrote her to be purposefully ignorant to the situation. But now I want to return to OB. So when he met AD Doug and OB heard Loki's tale, it reminded him of a book that he wrote called The Sons of Yoren. And when his character was introduced, there was the same wall of sticky notes that appears in the end credits, which seems to be Obi having plotted out his novel. So keep in mind that the first episode of the season was called Ouroboros. There has been a very obvious cyclical storytelling, and now Loki has the ability to travel through time at will. I think it's impossible to say if Obi was involved in the founding of the TVA. He wrote the manual and created the first temp pad, but did he only write the manual because of the information he got from Victor Timely, or did Victor Timely only learn the information after reading the manual written by OB? It's a snake eating its own tail, but now it's a tale that Loki has the ability to retell. Now, it's unlikely that Loki isn't going to use this ability to fix the temporal loom, but he could also rewrite his own story, perhaps preventing himself from being captured by the TVA in the first place. Or, in the end, also the beginning, he could set himself up as the founder of the TVA. This stuff ties into Marvel's God of Stories moniker that they applied to Loki all the way back during Secret Wars in 2015. It wasn't obvious to me until now that that's where the story was heading, but to be honest, it doesn't really interest me. Personally, I think the God of Stories is one of the most boring and mishandled character evolutions in Marvel Comics. In fact, with this new power, I imagine that there's going to be something anticlimactic about the finale. I'm sure there will be some final wrench in the works, and Loki will have to sacrifice something to truly move on from being the God of Mischief, and it'll be some way to subvert the storytelling. Because if there's one truth about modern storytelling, it's that subverting expectations comes before actually having something to say. But I'm interested to hear your theories about what will take place in the finale, so post those in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate it if you would hit that like button and subscribe to my channel, as well as the notification bell so you never miss out on a new video. Thanks for watching.